blade flashed across an open palm in front of the throne. Blood ran fast and bright onto white marble. A woman in a torn gray dress fell to one knee on the dais. She pressed her bleeding hand flat against the stone step below the king's seat. Guards drew swords. Courtiers backed away. A noble lady screamed and dropped her wine cup. The cup rolled and stopped against the woman's bare foot. The hall went silent for one long breath. Then she spoke 5 old words no living person had used in 200 years. The young king on the throne did not move. His face went white as the marble beneath her hand. He knew those words. He knew exactly what she had just done to him. Who was this dying seamstress, and why did the young king of Aldwyn look so afraid of her? Stay with me. Her name was Lyrian Ash. She was 39 years old. She had served as a palace seamstress for 16 years. She lived in a small room above the laundry yards, with a single window facing the garden wall. For most of her life, she had been invisible to the great people of Aldwyn. She mended their coats. She let out their waistlines. She stitched their mourning veils after their parents died. She never spoke unless spoken to. She kept her hands clean and her tongue still. That was how a palace seamstress survived in the kingdom of Aldwyn. But 3 weeks before the day at the throne, the fever came down from the lower city. It started near the river docks. It crawled up the narrow streets and slipped through the gates of the inner town. People coughed blood into their pillows. People fell asleep and did not wake. The healers said it ate the lungs from inside. They said only the strong young and the very lucky walked away from it. Lyrian was not strong, and she was not young. By the second week, she could not climb the stairs to her own room without resting twice. By the third week, she coughed red onto her sewing cloth. The other seamstresses moved her bed to the corner. They left her bowls of broth at the door. They closed the door quickly when they left. Believe me, they were not cruel. They were only frightened. Lyrian lay in her small bed and watched the light move across the wall. She knew the shape of dying. She had seen her mother die of it. She had seen 2 sisters die of it. She knew she had perhaps a week, perhaps less. And in that week she had to decide one thing. She had to decide what to do with the only secret she had ever been told. The secret had been given to her by her grandmother on a winter night many years before. Her grandmother was a quiet woman who had once worked in the same palace, in the same laundry yards, sewing the same coats and veils. Her grandmother had taken her hand on that winter night and pressed something cold into her palm. It was a small iron ring. On the ring were 5 words in the old tongue. Her grandmother had made her say the words aloud 3 times. Then her grandmother had told her this. If ever a king of Aldwyn breaks the old pact with our line, you will know what to do with this ring. You will know because the wrong will not let you sleep. You will know because the truth of it will sit on your chest like a stone. Until then, keep the ring hidden and keep your mouth shut. Lyrian had been 12 years old that winter. She had not understood. She had hidden the ring inside the hem of her best dress and forgotten about it for years. She had not believed in old pacts. She had not believed in kings owing anything to seamstresses. She had only believed in keeping her job and keeping her head down. But that was before she had taken a coat to the king's private chambers 2 summers earlier and seen something she should not have seen. The king had been a young man then, only 23. Aldrich Varen. He had taken the throne after his father's sudden death. He had been alone in his chamber when she brought the coat, and he had been crying. On his desk, open and unsigned, was an old letter. She had only meant to lay the coat across the chair. She had not meant to read anything. But the letter had been thick, and the writing had been large, and her eyes had caught 2 names she knew. One name was her grandmother's. The other name was a boy who had been hanged in the lower city 20 years before for a crime Lyrian now suspected he had not done. A boy who had been the son of her grandmother's closest friend. A boy whose mother had walked into the river the next spring and never come out. She had said nothing. She had laid the coat down. She had curtsied. She had walked out. but she had not slept properly for 2 summers since. The stone had sat on her chest. Now the fever was killing her, and the stone was still there. Now here is the thing. Lyrian knew she had 6 days, maybe 7. And she knew the ring under her mattress would never get a second chance. On the morning of the High Court, she got out of bed before dawn. She washed her face in cold water. She dressed in her cleanest gray gown, the one she kept for funerals. She tied her hair back. She tucked the iron ring inside her left fist. She tucked a small sewing knife into her right sleeve. She walked down the back stairs slowly, holding the wall. She passed the kitchen yard and the cook saw her and asked if she was well. Lyrian said yes, only a walk. The cook nodded and went back to his bread. She walked through the long corridor that led to the throne hall. She did not feel her own feet. Her chest burned. Her vision narrowed to a thin gray tunnel. Twice she stopped to lean against a column. Once she coughed into her sleeve and saw the red there, and folded the sleeve in so no one would see. She kept walking. She had not come this far to fall in a hallway. The doors to the throne hall stood open. High Court was in session. Nobles in fur and velvet lined the walls. Petitioners knelt at the long carpet. Guards stood at every pillar. At the far end on the raised marble dais sat young King Aldrich Varen in a high black chair, his crown small and plain on his head. He was 25 now. He was listening to a dispute about a flour tax. He looked tired. Lyrian stepped inside. A guard at the door reached for her arm and then saw her gray face and stopped. He thought she was a sick servant looking for the wrong room. He let her pass. She walked the long carpet. She walked past the kneeling petitioners. She walked past the rows of staring nobles. She heard a whisper start and spread behind her, like dry leaves moving. She did not turn her head. Her eyes were on the king. The king saw her at 20 paces. His mouth opened slightly. He did not know her name, but he had seen her face in his rooms for 16 years. He knew she did not belong on the long carpet at High Court. He raised one hand, almost gently, as if to ask what is wrong. That is when she took the small sewing knife from her sleeve. That is when she opened her own left palm with one clean cut. That is when the iron ring fell from her hand and rang once against the marble step. That is when she pressed her bleeding palm flat against the dais of the king. That is when she said 5 words in the old tongue that none of the nobles understood, but that the king of Aldwyn understood perfectly. Her blood spread in a small dark circle around the iron ring. The guards drew steel. The hall went silent. The young king did not move. For one breath the throne hall stood as still as a painting. The king's face had gone the color of old paper. His hand was still half raised, frozen in the air. Lyrian knelt with her bleeding palm pressed to the marble step, her chest heaving, her gray gown stained at the hem. Then a guard captain shouted. Steel rang. 3 guards rushed forward, with swords lowered toward Lyrian's back. They had orders simple as a heartbeat. Any blade drawn near the king meant death on the spot. The king finally moved. He stood up so quickly his black chair scraped the marble behind him. He held up one hand, palm out, fingers spread. He said one word, loud and clear. Stop. The guards stopped. Their boots squealed on the polished floor. The captain looked confused. The hall looked confused. The king of Aldwyn did not stop a strike against an assassin. The king of Aldwyn let the strike land, and then asked questions later. That was the law of the dais. Every man and woman in that hall knew it. But King Aldrich Varen was staring at the iron ring on the step. He was staring at the small dark circle of blood spreading around it. He was staring at the 5 old words still hanging in the air. And the look on his face was not the look of a king watching an attack. It was the look of a man who has been waiting for a knock on his door for 20 years, and the knock has finally come. He came down the dais steps slowly. He stopped 1 pace away from Lyrian. He looked down at her face. He saw the fever red under her pale skin. He saw the blood on her sleeve from her cough. He saw a woman who already had 1 foot in the grave. He saw a woman who had nothing left to lose. He knelt. The king of Aldwyn knelt on the marble step beside a dying seamstress, in front of the entire high court, in front of his guards, in front of the nobles. He picked up the iron ring with his own fingers. He turned it once in the light. He read the 5 old words engraved on the inside. His shoulders dropped just slightly, the way a man's shoulders drop when a long-feared thing has finally arrived. The captain of the guard found his voice. "My king, step back. Let us take her." The king did not look up. He said, "Leave her." He said it quietly, but every person in the hall heard it. He said, "No man touches her." He said, "No man speaks of this outside this room until I say." The captain bowed. The nobles bowed. The petitioners bowed. The hall obeyed, because a king's quiet word in a moment like that is heavier than a shouted one. The king put the iron ring back into Lyrian's bleeding hand. He closed her fingers around it gently. He said, "You should not be on your knees." He stood and lifted her by her elbow, slowly, carefully, as if she were made of dry paper. She nearly fell. He held her. He guided her to a small side door beside the dais, the one that led to the king's private rooms. The two of them passed through it. The door closed behind them. The hall stayed bowed. Inside the private antechamber, the king led her to a wooden chair by a low fire. He gave her water. She drank. He gave her a clean linen cloth. She wrapped her bleeding palm. He sat down across from her. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire popped. Somewhere far off a bell rang the hour. Then the king said, "You carried that ring for how long?" Lyrian said, "Since I was 12. My grandmother gave it to me." The king said, "What was her name?" Lyrian said the name. The king closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long time. He whispered, "I am sorry." He said it again. "I am sorry." Lyrian said, "I do not have much time, my king. The fever has me." The king opened his eyes. He said, "How long?" Lyrian said, 6 days. "Maybe 7. The king nodded slowly. He understood what the pact meant now. He understood that this dying woman, who he had passed in corridors 100 times without seeing, had just bound him with the oldest law of his bloodline. He understood that she had 6 days. He understood that the law gave him those 6 days, and not 1 hour more, to right the wrong her grandmother's line had carried in silence for 20 years. If he failed, the crown itself was forfeit by the old word. He looked into the fire. He did not look at her. He said, "You read the letter, did you not?" "In my chamber. 2 summers ago." She said, "Yes, my king." He said, "I have not slept since the day I wrote it." She said, "Neither have I, my king. Since the day I read it." This was the calm before what came next. The fire popped. A small clock on the mantel ticked. For one breath the room felt almost peaceful, 2 tired people sitting by a low fire, drinking water, breathing slowly. Outside, the hall had emptied. Outside, the city was beginning a quiet afternoon. Lyrian sipped her water and closed her eyes. The king watched the flames and said nothing. He was thinking, perhaps, that the worst part was over. He was wrong. The double doors of the antechamber burst open. They struck the inner walls with a crack like splitting wood. 3 men walked in. They were not guards. They wore the dark green sashes of the king's high council. The man in the front, tall and gray-bearded, was Lord Chancellor Haven Rowe, the same man who had served the king's father, and the same man who, 20 years before, had ordered the hanging of a boy in the lower city. He pointed at Lyrian with one long finger. He said, "That woman is under arrest for an attack on the royal person." "Step aside, my king." The king did not stand up. He said, "She is not under arrest. She is under my protection." The chancellor smiled the way a man smiles when he hears a child speak nonsense. He said, "My king, with respect, the law is clear." A blade was drawn within 10 paces of the throne. The hall saw it. The guards saw it. I cannot allow this woman to leave the palace alive. It would be a public sickness. The king finally stood. He was taller than the chancellor by half a head, but the chancellor did not move. The chancellor had stood beside 3 kings. He was not afraid of a fourth. The king said, "Do you know the words she spoke on my dais?" The chancellor said, "Gibberish. Old peasant gibberish." The king said, "No. They are the words of the blood pact of the second Varan king. They were spoken once, 200 years ago, by a midwife who saved the queen and lost her own daughter in the same hour. They bind the crown to the speaker for the count of her remaining days. If the crown does not deliver justice within that count, the crown itself is forfeit by oath of God and of bloodline. I read it as a boy. My father read it as a boy. You, Chancellor, read it as a boy as well. Do not pretend with me." For the first time the Chancellor's smile faltered. Only for a moment. He recovered. He said, "My king, that pact is a story. A legend in an old book. It has no power in a modern court." The king said, "Then why has your face just gone gray?" The Chancellor did not answer. He looked at Lyrian. He looked at the bandage on her hand. He looked at her gray gown and her fevered eyes. He calculated. He was a man who had survived 3 reigns by knowing exactly when to bend and exactly when to strike. He bent. He said, "Very well, my king. I will withdraw the arrest. I will inform the hall that this is a matter of private royal grace. But I will need to know what crime she claims, so I may begin an investigation in the king's name." The king looked at Lyrian. Lyrian looked back at the king. They both understood in that instant what the Chancellor was really asking. The Chancellor wanted the name. The Chancellor wanted to know which old crime had been pulled out of the dark. Because if the Chancellor knew, the Chancellor could shape it. The Chancellor could bury it under a new story. The Chancellor could turn the Seamstress's 6 days into a slow stall, and a quiet illness, and a forgotten funeral. The king said, "I will not name the crime yet, Chancellor." "Withdraw." The Chancellor bowed. He turned. As he reached the doors he paused. He looked back at Lyrian, and for a heartbeat his eyes were not those of a tired old courtier. They were the eyes of a wolf who has just realized which sheep in the field knows his face. Then he was gone. The doors closed. Lyrian said quietly, "My king, he will try to kill me before the 6 days are out." The king said, "I know." She said, "What will you do?" The king said, "What I should have done at 13 years old. I will tell the truth. And I will tell it before he can stop me. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button, because what happens in the next 3 days nearly tears the kingdom of Aldwin in half." The king moved Lyrian that same hour. He did not move her to a guest room. He did not move her to the infirmary. Both could be reached too easily. He moved her instead to a small chamber inside his own private apartments, one that shared a wall with his own bedroom. He posted only 2 guards at the outer door, both men he had grown up with as squires. He sent for his own physician, a quiet woman named Mara Velt, and told her plainly that the seamstress's life was now the life of the crown, and that she was to be kept comfortable, awake, and breathing for as many days as her body could be coaxed to give. Then the king sat at his desk and began to write. He wrote for the rest of that afternoon and most of the night. He wrote a confession. He wrote it in his own hand, in plain words on heavy paper. He wrote about a winter when he had been 13, and his father had been ill, and the Chancellor had been the real power in the palace. He wrote about a small thing he had done. A childish thing. He had stolen a silver hunting horn from his father's study and lost it in the lower city while playing at being a soldier with a friend. He had been terrified to tell his father. So he had told the Chancellor. The Chancellor had smiled and patted his head and said, "Leave it with me, my prince." The next morning, a boy in the lower city had been arrested for the theft. A boy named Tomas, the son of a candle maker. A boy who had never been inside the palace in his life. The king wrote that he had heard about the arrest at supper that night. He had not understood at first. When he understood, he had run to the chancellor in tears. He had said, "That boy did not do it. It was me. I lost the horn." The chancellor had knelt in front of him and held his shoulders gently and said, "My prince, kings do not confess to thefts. Kings do not stand in courts beside candle-makers' sons. I have already arranged the matter. The boy will be sent to the country. He will be fine. You will be a great king one day, and a great king cannot start his reign with a stolen horn around his neck." The king wrote that he had believed the chancellor. He was 13. He was frightened. He had nodded and gone to bed. 3 days later, he had heard a maid say in the corridor that the candle-maker's boy had been hanged in the lower city square at dawn, as a thief and a warning to other thieves. The king wrote that he had vomited into a chamber pot and crawled into the back of a wardrobe and not come out for a day. He wrote that he had never spoken of it again. He wrote that he had carried it for 12 years. He wrote that he had become king 2 years ago and had still not found the courage to open the matter. He wrote that he was opening it now, because a dying seamstress had walked the long carpet and given him no further place to hide. He signed the confession at the bottom. He sealed it with the royal seal. He made 2 more copies in his own hand and sealed those as well. He gave 1 copy to his physician Mara, with orders to ride at first light to the high temple in the river city and place it in the hand of the high priestess herself. He gave 1 copy to his oldest squire friend, with orders to ride at first light to the lord of the northern province, a man known to be honest and known to hate the chancellor. He kept the 3rd copy on his own person. By the time the sun rose, 3 sealed confessions were moving in 3 directions across the kingdom of Aldwyn, and no living man, not even the chancellor, knew exactly where each one would land first. But the chancellor was not idle. He had spent the night also. He had not slept. He had called in his own men. He had sent his own riders. He had spoken with the captain of the city watch, who owed him a great deal, and he had spoken with the keeper of the palace gates, who owed him more. By the 2nd morning, every road out of the capital had a quiet pair of eyes on it, and every gate had a list of names. The chancellor did not yet know who carried the king's confession. But he knew it had been written. He could feel it in the palace air, the way an old hunter feels a deer in the trees before he sees it. On the 2nd morning, Lyrian woke weaker than the night before. She could not stand. Her cough brought up dark blood. The physician Mara sat beside her and held her hand, and lied gently about how much time was left. The king came in before noon. He sat on the edge of the bed. He told her quietly what he had written and what he had sent. He told her that within 4 days the confession would be read aloud in the high temple and in the northern province, and that no chancellor on earth could put that fire out once it was lit. He told her that the boy named Tomas would be named in those readings. He told her that the boy's mother, who had walked into the river, would be named. He told her that her grandmother would be named. He told her that her own name would be named, as the keeper of the ring and the speaker of the pact. Lyrian closed her eyes. A small sound came out of her, almost a laugh. She said, "My grandmother is going to hear her name said inside a temple. She is going to like that." The king smiled for the first time in 2 days. But that night the chancellor moved. He did not strike at the king. He was too careful for that. He struck at the messengers. His riders had been watching the roads, and by dusk they had identified the physician Mara and the squire friend as the 2 most likely couriers. 2 ambushes were set on 2 different roads, one at a ford and one at a forest crossing. The chancellor's men had orders to recover the sealed letters and to leave no witnesses behind. It almost worked. The physician Mara was attacked at the ford at moonrise. 3 men with covered faces came down the bank toward her. But Mara was not only a physician. She had been raised on a horse farm in the south, and she knew her animal better than the attackers knew their own. She wheeled her mare into the shallow water and fled downriver, taking a cut across her shoulder, but keeping the sealed letter inside her jerkin. She reached the high temple of the river city at dawn, bleeding through her cloak, and put the king's confession into the high priestess's hand exactly as ordered. The squire friend was less lucky. He was attacked in the forest crossing 2 hours before dawn. He took an arrow through the thigh and a sword cut across the face. He killed one of his attackers before he fell from the saddle. The other two left him for dead in the wet leaves and rode away with the sealed letter. They did not check his pulse. They were in a hurry. He crawled half a mile to charcoal burner's hut and was found there at midday by a small boy gathering kindling. The boy ran for a village priest. The priest, hearing the squire's whispered story, sent a fast rider of his own to the lord of the northern province, carrying not the sealed letter but a plain spoken message that began, "The king has confessed, and the chancellor is hunting the truth." By the time the chancellor's two surviving men returned to the palace, proud of their stolen letter, the news had already overtaken them on a different road. On the third morning, the high priestess of the river city stood up in the great temple at dawn prayer, and read the king's confession aloud to a packed hall of pilgrims, merchants, and traveling lords. She did not soften any part of it. She read the name of the boy Tomas. She read the name of his mother, who had walked into the river. She read the name of Lyrian's grandmother. She read the name of the dying seamstress in the palace. She read the name of the chancellor. By midday that story was moving along the river road on every cart and every horse. By the afternoon it had reached the next town. By the evening it had reached the gates of the capital itself. The chancellor felt it first as a draught of cold air crossed the back of his neck during the council meeting. A messenger he did not know came in. The messenger looked at him oddly. The messenger looked at the king oddly. The messenger said, "My lords, there is news from the river temple." The chancellor's face did not change. He had spent 40 years not letting his face change. But under the table his hands tightened on each other slowly, the way a man's hands tighten when he hears his own funeral bell from a long way off. The king rose from his seat at the head of the council. He said, "Read it." The messenger read. The council heard. When the messenger had finished, the king looked at the chancellor. The chancellor looked back at the king. They had not been alone in a room since Lyrian had walked the long carpet. The other council members did not breathe. The king said, "Lord Chancellor Haven-Rowe, by your hand, 20 years ago, a child of my city was hanged for a theft he did not commit. By your hand, since then the truth has been buried, threatened, and now hunted on the open roads of this kingdom. By your hand, 2 riders of mine were attacked last night, and one nearly killed. You will surrender your seal to the table now. You will be held in the lower tower until the high lords of all 4 provinces have read the confession in their own halls. After that you will stand before a court of those high lords, and not before a court of your own choosing, and you will answer for the boy, for his mother, for the seamstress's grandmother, and for the seamstress herself." The chancellor did not move at first. Then slowly, with the great calm of a man who has run out of moves on a board he has played for 40 years, he took the heavy silver seal of his office from around his neck. He laid it on the table. He stood. He bowed very slightly to the king. He said only, "My king, I served 3 kings before you, and I never thought the 4th would be the one with the spine." Then he allowed the captain of the guard to walk him out. The council did not speak for a long minute. Then one by one, every man in the room stood and bowed to the king. Not as courtiers bow. As men bow. The king did not see most of it. He was already on his way down the corridor, almost running, back to the small chamber beside his own bedroom, where a dying seamstress was waiting to hear whether her 6 days had been enough. Lyrian lived 2 more days. She was awake for most of the first one. The king sat with her for long stretches. He told her how the chancellor had been moved to the lower tower. He told her how the lord of the northern province had ridden in person to the capital and had embraced him in the courtyard like a son. He told her how the river temple confession had been copied and sent to every chapel in the kingdom, so that the name Tomas of the candle maker, and the name of his mother, and the name of her grandmother would be read at every dawn service for a year. He told her also that the boy Tomas would be buried again, properly this time, in the cathedral garden, with a stone of white marble carved by the best mason in the city. He told her that her grandmother's name would be carved on the same stone, just below the boys, because the old pact and the new justice belonged to both of them. He asked her if she wanted her own name on the stone too. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "No, my king. Put me at the bottom of the garden, near the wall. I am only the one who walked the carpet. The two of them are the reason I had something to walk for." He nodded. He kept her hand. On the second day, she slept more than she spoke. By evening, she could not lift her head from the pillow. The physician Mara, with a bandaged shoulder of her own, gave her something for the pain. The king did not leave the room. He sat in the wooden chair beside the bed. He held her hand on top of the blanket. Outside the window, the city of Aldwyn was quiet. The fever was beginning to lift from the lower streets, as fevers eventually do. Sometime in the small hours of the morning, Lyrian Ash opened her eyes one last time. She looked at the young king, and she smiled at him, the small private smile of a woman who has finished a long piece of stitching and is pleased with the seam. She closed her eyes. Her breath went out slowly. It did not come back in. The king did not move for a long time. Then he laid her hand gently on top of the blanket, exactly the way she used to lay coats across chairs. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was not a state funeral because she had refused one. But the king walked behind the small cart that carried her, in plain dark clothes, through the streets of the city. The streets were lined 6 deep with people. They did not cheer. They did not weep loudly. They stood in silence and let the cart pass. The cart went to the cathedral garden, and Lyrian Ash was buried near the back wall, in a simple grave, with a small gray stone that gave only her name and her trade. Palace Seamstress. The boy Tomas was reburied at the front of the garden, under his white marble stone, with his mother's name and Lyrian's grandmother's name carved beneath his. The king himself laid the first handful of earth on that grave. He stood there for a long time before he walked away. Lord Chancellor Haven Rowe was tried by the 4 high lords of the provinces 6 weeks later. He did not deny the boy's hanging. He did not deny the river ambush. He spoke only once during the trial, when asked if he had any regret. He said, "I have served the throne." He was stripped of all titles, all lands, all monies, and sent to live the rest of his life in a small stone cell in the northern province, where the only window faces the mountains and not the road. He died there 2 winters later alone, with no priest in the room. The kingdom of Aldwyn did not become a perfect place after that. Kingdoms never do. But something quiet had changed. Petitions were heard more carefully. Confessions, when they came, were not buried. Every year on the morning of the day Lyrian walked the long carpet, the king himself read aloud the 5 old words of the blood pact in the throne hall, in front of the full court, so that no one in the kingdom would forget what it had once cost a dying seamstress to make a king remember a boy named Tomas. King Aldrich Varen reigned for 31 years after that morning. He was not always wise. He was not always kind. But he never, after Lyrian Ash, sent a man to the gallows without sitting in the room while the sentence was read. And he never again, for the rest of his life, walked past a quiet woman in a gray gown in a palace corridor without slowing down and looking her in the face. Just in case. Just in case she too was carrying a small iron ring inside her closed left hand.